Most gardeners lose their cucumber seedlings in the first few days without even realizing they are the ones causing the problem. They plant a healthy young cucumber, water it heavily, loosen the soil around it, maybe add fertilizer because the leaves look tired, and then wonder why the plant seems to stop growing. I used to make some of those mistakes myself, and I learned the hard way that the first 5 days after planting are not the time to push a cucumber to grow faster. They are the time to help it settle down and rebuild its roots. When you move a cucumber seedling from a pot into the garden, even a healthy plant can look weak for a while because its small roots have been disturbed, and the plant suddenly has to adjust to new soil, different temperatures, wind, sunlight, and moisture. One old gardener showed me years ago that the best thing you can sometimes give a young cucumber is less attention, not more. He told me to watch the plant carefully, but to stop trying to fix every little change I saw. That advice saved me more seedlings than any expensive product I ever bought. During these first few days, I want the soil warm, the roots protected, and the moisture steady, but I do not want the ground turned into a wet, heavy mess. I also do not want cold water poured straight onto a young root system that is already under stress. There is a simple way I check this without buying anything. I put my finger into the soil about 2 inches deep and feel what is happening below the surface. If it is cool and slightly moist, I leave it alone. If it is genuinely dry, I give it a careful watering around the root area. This little habit sounds almost too simple, but it can prevent one of the biggest mistakes people make during transplanting. And there is another mistake that looks helpful at first, but can quietly damage the tiny roots just when they are trying to recover. I made it myself more than once, and once you understand what happens underneath the soil, you will probably never do it to a young cucumber again. The first thing I stopped doing after learning this lesson was feeding cucumber seedlings immediately after planting them. I understand why people do it because the plant has just been moved and it looks like it needs strength, so it feels natural to give it fertilizer right away. But during these first few days, I want the roots to recover before I ask them to take in extra food. The roots have been moved from a small container into the garden, and some of the fine roots have been disturbed during that process. If you pour a strong fertilizer solution around those fresh roots, you are giving the plant more work at exactly the wrong time. I remember doing this years ago because I thought more care meant better care, and instead of seeing new growth, I watched the cucumber sit there for days looking tired. Since then, I have kept the first 5 or 6 days very simple. Warm water when the soil actually needs it, and nothing that forces the plant to grow before the roots are ready. This is one of those old garden habits that costs nothing, because the best thing you can do is often simply leave the plant alone. Another mistake I see is planting the seedling too deep because gardeners remember that some other vegetables can handle deep planting. With cucumbers, I prefer to keep the root area close to the level where the plant was already growing rather than burying a large part of the stem. The base of the stem should stay open and should not sit in constantly wet soil. If the plant needs support, I would rather gently firm the soil around the root ball than bury the stem deeper. Then comes watering, and this is where many good intentions cause trouble. I do not pour a large amount of water over the entire bed just because the cucumber has been planted. I water carefully around the root area and then wait. The soil should have moisture, but it should not stay heavy and soaked. I learned to use room temperature water because very cold water can shock a young, shallow root system, especially when the soil has warmed during the day. I simply fill a container earlier and let the water come closer to the temperature of the garden. It costs nothing and takes almost no effort. There is also a simple old method I use to keep the moisture steady without watering constantly, and it involves something many gardeners already have lying around instead of something they need to buy. There is one simple thing I started doing after planting cucumbers that made those first few days much easier, and it costs almost nothing. I use a thin layer of clean, dry mulch around the plant, but I keep it a little distance away from the stem. Years ago, an older gardener showed me this habit and told me that young cucumber roots do not need a gardener constantly pouring water on them. They need the moisture to stay reasonably steady. That made sense to me, because I had seen what happened when the soil was allowed to dry quickly during a warm afternoon. The leaves would soften, and I would immediately grab the hose. Then, the next morning, the soil would still be heavy and wet, and I had created another problem while trying to solve the first one. A little mulch helps slow that sudden drying. Clean dry leaves or another suitable garden material can work if you already have it. So there is no need to spend money on a special product just for those first few days. I spread it lightly around the root area and leave the stem clear so air can move around the base and moisture does not sit directly against it. Most gardeners think mulch is something you add later when the plant is already strong, but I found that a simple thin layer can make the early recovery much steadier. Still, there is something even more important than the mulch, and that is what you do with the soil itself. I do not loosen the soil around a newly planted cucumber during these first days. This may seem strange if you grew up hearing that a garden should always be freshly loosened and neat, but cucumber roots are close to the surface and they are easily disturbed. I have damaged more young plants with a hoe than I ever helped with one. You may see a little crust forming on the surface and feel that you should break it apart, but I would rather leave it alone for now than risk cutting the small roots underneath. The roots are already busy rebuilding themselves, and every unnecessary movement can slow that process. I learned to watch the leaves instead of digging to see what is happening below. A little softness during a hot afternoon does not always mean the plant is in trouble. If it becomes firm again later in the day, that can be perfectly normal. The sign that concerns me is when the plant still looks tired early in the morning. That tells me the problem may be deeper, and before I add anything, I check the soil. But there is another small detail during these first days that many gardeners completely miss, and it can tell you whether the cucumber is quietly recovering or actually struggling. By the fourth and fifth day, I start looking at the cucumber a little differently, because now I want to know whether the plant is actually settling into its new home or whether something is still holding it back. I do not expect a big jump in height at this point, and I do not panic if the plant looks almost the same as it did on planting day. A cucumber can be doing important work underneath the soil, while the leaves seem to be standing still. One of the best signs I look for is the growing point in the center. If that little point is still green and alive, I take that as encouragement. Then I look at the stem and the leaves. The plant should gradually begin to look firmer and recover more easily after the heat of the afternoon. Sometimes the first sign of recovery is nothing more than a tiny new leaf appearing in the center, but that small leaf tells me something important, because the plant is beginning to spend energy on growth instead of simply trying to survive. An older grower once told me not to measure a cucumber by how many inches it grows during the first week. He said to measure it by how much confidence the plant shows each morning. I did not understand that phrase at first, but after enough seasons I learned exactly what he meant. A cucumber that is settling properly looks more stable before it looks bigger. If the plant is still weak after several days, I do not immediately reach for fertilizer. I first check the soil and the temperature because cold soil can keep a cucumber from moving forward, even when there's plenty of food available. I remember watching a neighbor feed his young cucumbers again and again, because they looked pale and slow, while I simply waited for warmer nights and kept the moisture steady. When the weather finally settled, my plants began growing while his stayed stressed. That taught me a lesson I still follow today. Patience can save more seedlings than another bottle from the garden store. I also keep checking the soil below the surface instead of watering because the top looks dry. If there is still moisture deeper down, I leave the plant alone. And I especially avoid heavy watering late in the evening when nights are cool because cold, wet soil can keep a young cucumber under stress. There is one more habit that matters here, and most beginners never think about it. They keep touching the plant, moving the stem, lifting leaves, and pressing the soil around the roots to see if everything is firm. I stopped doing that years ago because the cucumber needs calm conditions now, and the less we disturb those young roots, the better chance they have to spread into the surrounding soil. By the 5th day, I am watching for one particular change because it tells me much more than the color of the older leaves. I want to see the newest leaf in the center beginning to open and the stem holding itself a little more firmly than it did on the day of planting. That is the sign I trust because it means the cucumber is beginning to work again instead of simply recovering from the move. I also look at the little tendrils near the leaf joints because when they start reaching out and looking for something to hold on to, I know the plant is waking up properly. Most gardeners miss this because they look at the whole plant and think nothing is happening. But I learned a long time ago that the newest growth tells the story much better than the older leaves. An older leaf can stay soft or slightly tired for several days and still be perfectly fine. If the center is producing fresh growth, I leave it alone. This is also the point where I am most careful about the temptation to feed. You finally see the plant improving, and you think it must need more food, so you reach for fertilizer. I understand that feeling because I used to do exactly the same thing. But a cucumber that is just beginning to recover does not need to be pushed. It needs stable conditions so those new roots can continue spreading. The old method I still follow is simple. Warm water when the soil needs it, protection from cold nights, a little mulch if the ground dries too quickly, and nothing unnecessary around the roots. It saves money because you do not need to buy a special transplant product just because the label promises faster recovery. Good soil, steady moisture, warmth, and patience are already doing most of the work. If the nights are cold, I use a light cover and remove it when the weather warms, especially if the cucumber is still small and exposed. If it is growing in a greenhouse, I also make sure fresh air can move through, because closing everything tightly can leave the plant struggling in hot, still air during the afternoon. These small details seem ordinary, but together they make the first week much easier for the plant. And there is one final mistake I want you to avoid, because it usually happens when the gardener thinks the danger has already passed. The cucumber finally looks better, the leaves are standing up, new growth has appeared, and that is exactly when many people begin changing everything at once. They water more, feed more, loosen the soil, and start training the vine before it is ready. I learned to resist that urge because steady progress is more valuable than sudden growth. Now that the cucumber has made it through those first 5 days, I become even more careful about what I change, because this is where a lot of gardeners accidentally undo the progress they have just gained. The plant may finally look stronger, and the newest leaf may be opening, so it is tempting to start feeding heavily or watering more often because you think the cucumber is ready to take off. I learned to resist that urge. The old method I still trust is to change one thing at a time, and only when the plant gives me a reason. If the soil has enough moisture, I do not add more water. If the newest growth is green and firm, I do not add fertilizer simply because I have some nearby. If the plant is standing well, I do not keep pressing the soil around the stem to make sure it is stable. Those small decisions seem almost boring, but they are what keep a young cucumber from being pushed backward just when it is beginning to recover. I also pay close attention to temperature because cucumbers respond strongly to cold conditions during this early stage. A plant can have good soil and enough moisture and still sit there without growing if the roots remain too cold. This is why I never judge the plant only by what I see above the ground. If the nights are still cool, I give the cucumber some protection rather than trying to force growth with extra food. That costs nothing and usually makes more sense than buying another product. There is another simple habit that has helped me many times. I try to keep the soil moisture steady rather than allowing it to swing from very dry to very wet. A little dry at the surface does not always mean the roots are dry, so I check below the surface before watering. If the soil still feels moist deeper down, I wait. If it is genuinely dry, I water slowly around the root area instead of flooding the whole bed. This encourages the roots to explore the surrounding soil without creating a constantly soaked area around the plant. And remember what we talked about earlier. cucumber roots sit close to the surface and unnecessary digging can damage them. I used to think loosening the soil was always helping, but after damaging several young plants, I learned that leaving the root area quiet can be one of the best things you do. By now, the goal is simple. Give the cucumber warmth, steady moisture, light, and time. If you see a fresh leaf forming and the plant looks more stable each morning, you're already seeing the result you wanted. But there is still one mistake that can appear after the plant looks healthy again, and it can quietly slow the cucumber just as the real growth is about to begin. By the end of the 5th day, I want to see one simple thing from my cucumber, and that is a plant that looks more settled than it did when I put it into the ground. I am not looking for a huge vine or a pile of new leaves because that is not how I judge the first few days. I look for a firmer stem, leaves that recover better after the afternoon heat, and most importantly, a fresh leaf beginning to open in the center. When I see that new growth, I know the roots are starting to work again. That is the moment when I stop worrying about transplant shock and start thinking about normal growth. I still check the soil before every watering because I never want to water by the calendar. If the soil is moist below the surface, I wait. If it is dried properly, I water slowly around the root area. I keep the stem clear, and I leave the soil around the roots alone because those small roots are now beginning to spread into their new home. This is one of those old methods that costs nothing and saves a lot of trouble. I also watch the weather closely because a warm afternoon can make us think summer has arrived, while a cold night can quietly stop a young cucumber from growing. If nights are still cool, I use a simple light cover when needed and remove it when the temperature rises. If the cucumbers are inside a greenhouse, I make sure fresh air can move through the space because closed hot air can make a young plant look tired even when the soil is fine. Most importantly, I do not rush into heavy feeding just because the plant has survived the first few days. The notes I have relied on for years make the same point. Real feeding is better moved into the 2nd week when the cucumber clearly shows stable new growth. I learned that a strong start is worth much more than a fast start. Water, warmth, protection, clean mulch when needed, and patience are often enough to get the plant through this delicate period. If you follow this simple routine, the cucumber has a much better chance of beginning the next week with stronger roots and steady growth. And once that first new leaf opens properly, there's another important job waiting, because what you do next can decide how strong those vines become when the first flowers finally appear.